a crowd or healing somebody. So Jesus, on that evening by the lake, took a few loaves and dried fish, gave thanks to God, and with that meager ration, he fed a multitude. Call this miracle the miracle of the multiplication of the loaves and fish. Now, another perspective of how we read this passage would be to deconstruct the event with our modern eyes in a way to attempt to get behind what was going on with this miracle. So Jesus, on the evening by the lake, noticed that someone brought a few loaves and dried fish, asked for them in order to share with others, gave thanks to God, and in that example, other people felt compelled and encouraged to share the little picnic meal that they themselves had packed for themselves. Called that same event, the feeding of the 5,000. It makes me think about the story of the stone soup that the kids shared a few weeks back. And yet, for me, either of those approaches feels unsatisfying. You explain a miracle with little to no critical or historical or scientific perspective, and we just have a version of faith that can't or won't ask hard questions. Or, on the other hand, you explain away the miracle, dismantling it into little pieces, little chunks that are easy to swallow, and we have a version of faith that misses what was so incredible about what Jesus was and what he did. So I wonder if instead we can look at the miracle story for its miracleness. And we look at it for its storyness. So if we look at what makes it a miracle, and we look at what makes it a story, and we keep our feet firmly planted in the 21st century, but we attempt to see with the eyes and hear with the ears of peasants in first century Palestine. I say that because this is a really important story. Maybe you don't realize this, but it's the only miracle story that appears in all four Gospels. It is an important narrative in terms of how the writer is trying to explain who Jesus is by showing these particular deeds that Jesus was doing. Like I said, this one shown in all four. There are large crowds. In the details we can see that there are large crowds that are hungry for something Jesus has. And the crowds in this case are looking for healing, and then Jesus also feeds them. And what is interesting about that story is that Jesus goes up a mountain and the people follow up the mountain. And it would have been something that would have been reminding them of how Moses went up a mountain and something amazing happened. It is also, the story tells us, close to the festival of the Passover. In the Passover, the people of Israel would remember how God got them out of Egypt, saved them from slavery. And they would eat unleavened bread, these little cracker-like bread, because they were in such a hurry to get out of Egypt. And here is Jesus up a mountain, and he feeds the crowd. It would not have been lost on them that here are some echoes of Moses. So already there's a higher and higher expectation or anticipation of how good Jesus was. And then he performs this sign that for sure makes them think, this is someone God has chosen. There's another couple of details that I want to point out in this story, and that is, this story is speaking to a specific group of people in society. The disciples are worried about money. They talk about they don't have enough money. Oh my goodness, 6 months' wages wouldn't begin to pay. You know, if you've ever had unexpected guests coming to your home for a meal, how do you tell the disciples, family, hold back when there's 5,000 people lining up? And the other detail that makes it clearer that this is a particular audience that Jesus is trying to reach is that it is barley bread. barley was cheaper, and the people who were poor, who couldn't afford the wheat bread, would make themselves a loaf with barley. And when we read, what we read is that Jesus saw a multitude who was hungry for more than one thing, but physically also hungry. And like a shepherd, he brings them up the hill where there is nice grass, makes them lay down, makes them wait, and will feed them. And then there was enough. There was more than enough. There were baskets full of leftovers from that meal. The people who witnessed, or the people who heard the story, would have been mindful of all those details I just pointed out. And they would have felt a connection to Jesus, because they would have felt that this story was about them. Although apparently some misread the signals, because then they tried to by force make him king, and Jesus has to step aside. Being critical readers of the Bible story, and at the same time being people of faith, leads me to make a differentiation between a magic trick and a miracle. A magic trick is an illusion of something grand, and a miracle is the unexpected coming to life. With a magic trick, we know we're being tricked, but we enjoy the show. And we still wonder how they do it. That beautiful assistant saw it in two and then put it back together. The elephant on stage that vanishes momentarily. The card you selected was the Three of Hearts. But with a miracle, we know something has happened. Something which is very much real, and whose unexpected outcome is what we're trying to fit into our heads. The young soccer players in Thailand, all rescued. 10 years ago, the oncologist said, only 3 more years. The parent finally forgives their grown child when their first grandchild is born. We read the gospel story when we, like the original audience, are hungry as well. Or we are looking for healing. Or we are looking for clear answers to what God is doing in our environment. And like if the Palestinians would have been worried about the Romans, we might be worried about what's happening in the government. We read it looking for answers. We read it trusting that God is there with us. We might even read the story, hoping that there's clever information or a clever solution that will present itself. Or maybe we are expecting a miracle to materialize. God does what God does, and it will always go beyond our expectations. Did you catch that sentence that Emma was reading in Ephesians? It says, "Now to God, who by the power at work within us is able to accomplish abundantly far more than all we can ask or imagine. To God be the glory." Bishop John Shelby Spong writes that being people of faith focuses on the experience of God, not on the explanation of God. Although, of course, we try to explain God, and Bishop Spong is trying to tell us that we ought to let our explanation of who God is evolve through time as we get more information and we ourselves grow. And so as God does what God does, in both the miraculous and the mundane, we are invited to participate. We are not bystanders of the experience of God, but we are participants, maybe even co-creators of that experience. We might even get more than we bargained for, like that surprised boy who all of a sudden had to give up his food for this feeding. But something that then goes on to impact a whole community. Today's story for me highlights that we are witnesses of God's abundance. A witness is somebody who literally sees, but also a witness is somebody who then gives testimony to what they saw. When the disciple noticed the few loaves that the peasant brought, that the young man brought, and the tiny fish, and they saw insignificance. They didn't think that this would go far. They saw poverty. That bread read poverty. But what Jesus saw was the tenacity and wisdom of the people, the willingness of people to gather, to be fed, and to be transformed. And then God does what God does. And in the miracleness, we marvel that all are fed. And in the storyness, we read that there's always more to Jesus than meets the eye. We are people of faith, and we seek to follow the direction we believe God sets out for us in our daily lives. One of the lessons I feel from this story is that there is abundance all around us, even when at first blush we underestimate what we're looking at, or worse yet, we don't see it at all. How many times have we found ourselves depleted, and we think there is no way we can manage the challenges before us? Or how often have we seen an individual or our community stuck or in trouble, and we think the only solution must have to come from outside? But there are resources close at hand which are part of the solution which we trust God to do or God to make happen when we become open to the miracleness in our midst. God does in the lives of people more than we could ever hope for or imagine. And not just with a miracle from on high, but rather with a miracle that springs from within. What does abundance then look like? Well, it looks like a peasant's picnic lunch, which feeds a multitude. It looks like a blessing hiding in plain sight, waiting for God to make a miracle unfold. Thanks be to God for God's word for us. Amen.